Hello and welcome to this contribution to the RNCM's Future Music Day 2020. Last year we came to you from the RNCM home in Manchester, but due to the coronavirus we're doing a virtual day exploring AI and music from our own homes. When I started research for my book, The Creativity Code, exploring how good AI is at the creative arts, I think my expectations were that it would be a reasonably good writer, quite a good composer, and not terribly good visual artist. I think this was partly fueled by the fact that visuals have always been one of the major hurdles for artificial intelligence. The human brain has evolved over millions of years to be able to take visual data and interpret it, but music and the written word is a much younger art form that the human brain has been navigating. So it's always seemed to me that the visual world has always presented a much bigger hurdle for AI to kind of jump. Also, data is very important in this age of machine learning, having data to learn on. And there's a huge amount of data of the written word, of music, but the data for the visual world seems so much harder to kind of navigate and kind of interpret. And if one thinks about the way that music and the written word works, it's very sequential in nature. So you will have a sequence of notes or a sequence of words and a very discrete choice of things that might follow that. So there's a really good chance that you can sort of learn what might be expected to follow a sequence of notes or words and make a pretty good prediction for how the thing might continue. So I think that was the reason why I thought the written word and music might be more possible to create via artificial intelligence, whilst the visual world will be very difficult. It turned out my expectations were completely wrong. The major success that machine learning has had is in the visual realm, by taking many images which have been labelled and producing a sort of database of questions that it can ask about a new image. That sequence of questions has enabled vision recognition software to do extremely well at identifying what might be in a new image. So visual recognition, one of the major successes of machine learning. So very good at recognizing visuals, but how good has it been at actually creating its own visuals? Well, when it comes to artists of the past, it's been reasonably successful. Taking, for example, an artist's style, learning that style, and then reproducing something in a similar style is something that AI has been pretty good at. If we take something like the next Rembrandt project, the AI took a lot of Rembrandt portraits, there are a good number of them, so good data set to learn on, understood that style, and then produced a new piece of work in the style of Rembrandt that is pretty convincing. In fact, when I've given audiences the AI Rembrandt and real Rembrandt and asked them to identify which one is the artificial one, generally they're pretty split in their decision about which one is real and which one is the fake one. So I think AI's done quite well in using the code that's emerged in the visual realm to be able to reproduce style. But for me, the most interesting challenge is to go into the new, to break style, make something interestingly creative, which we haven't seen before. And actually, there again, there have been some very interesting projects. I think the idea of a generative adversarial network, or a GAN, where one algorithm is tasked with creating, making suggestions, bubbling away, giving ideas, and then a second algorithm, the discriminator algorithm, then critiques what's being produced. This combination of two algorithms almost working together or against each other in a sort of competitive way has produced some very interesting new visual images which have really broken the mold. So I would say that this does capture actually how the creative mind works when we're producing something new, that there does seem to be kind of two voices in your head, one bubbly, creative, making suggestions, the other one, the discriminator, being very critical. In fact, neuroscience has shown that there does seem to be these two elements, creator and inhibitor, which are involved in the creative process. And I've been working actually with a visual artist in Mexico, Eduardo Terrazas, who's been very interested in something he calls the cosmic diagram as kind of framework for many of his artworks. And he's been using this diagram over the last 30, 40 years to create different variations on this particular theme. And I was very interested to see what machine learning would make of this, whether it would be able to offer new suggestions of ways to interpret this diagram. So I took a generative adversarial network developed by Ahmed El Gamel at Rutgers called Playform.io. In fact, it's an algorithm that you can experiment with at home. And I gave it a huge number of examples of Eduardo's work based on this diagram and asked it to make some suggestions of a new direction to go in. First of all, I was quite struck by the fact that the AI was able to identify the underlying diagram that was behind all of these images. And then it did offer something which was very different style to anything Eduardo had done in the past. And for me, a striking element of this was that style that the algorithm is producing seems to be behind many of the different suggestions that it's making when it's given a whole different range of data sets. So it's almost as if the algorithm has got its own personal artistic style. And I think audiences are beginning to pick up this kind of AI style. When I've done similar experiments giving human artwork and artwork generated by these GANs, anyone who spent some time exploring AI art is able to recognize the art produced by the GAN because of a slightly distinctive style that's beginning to emerge from these algorithms. So I was very excited by the opportunity that algorithms are giving visual artists for suggesting new directions to go in. So although AI has been quite successful in the visual realm, I've been very struck that my thought that it might make a good writer or composer has not turned out to be the case. I thought that this sequential nature of music and literature might mean that it would be a very easy way for the AI to start trying its own versions of text and music. And certainly some of the first attempts at AI music have taken this idea of learning what a sequence of notes, where it might go next. So for example, there's something called the jazz continuator, which uses this idea, and it can riff real time with a human jazz musician. And what it does is to analyze what the human jazz musician is doing, makes a probabilistic analysis of what might come next, and therefore can respond to what the human player has offered in a sort of call and response mode. And we did a project last year at Future Music at the RNCM, actually reproducing an event that I did at the Barbican, where we took Bach's keyboard works and we got an AI, MuseNet, to learn on these keyboard works, and then we gave it a kind of challenge of a new piece. It was one of the English suites where we'd taken parts of the music out and we asked the AI to fill in the gaps. So we created this hybrid AI Bach piece and then played this to audiences and asked them to identify where the joins were. And audiences found it very difficult because somehow the AI was very good at filling in these short gaps between where the Bach finished and took off again. And so they found it very difficult. The one person who actually was able to identify very clearly the joins, in fact, was the keyboard player, because the keyboard player said, I know when it hits the AI, because suddenly it becomes very difficult to play. Of course, AI is not embodied and doesn't care about fingerings, whilst Bach was very careful not only to produce good music, but also produce music that sat very nicely underneath the fingers. So it's interesting, that element of embodiment that's missing when AI is creating music. The other element that was missing that was quite striking was something that Mahan Esfahani, who performed the piece in the Barbican, picked up on. He said they're called the English suites for a very good reason, because Bach was not only interested in creating music, but was also interested in the spoken word. Now, in the case of the English suite, there are no words, but he was very interested in the cadences of language, and the musicality of language would often inform how he would compose. So they're called the English suites, not the French suites or the Italian concerto, for a good reason, because there's an extra kind of data set which is informing Bach's compositional process, which is the English spoken word. And of course, that's something that we didn't give the algorithm that data to learn on. So Mahan felt that it was kind of missing this quality about Bach's music. And I think that's very striking, because very often we give AI a very restricted data set to learn on. If it's creating music, we give it music. If it's creating visual art, we'll only give it visual art, and same with the spoken word. But of course, we humans, we create things informed by many different disciplines. If I'm doing a painting, music, spoken word will contribute massively also to what I might be painting. So I think this is one thing going forward that we need to address, that we need to give an AI not just the restricted data set of music, but to give it many more things if we're hoping for it to create something that is as rich as human creativity. And I think you see this especially in the case of the written word. One of the reasons I think that AI is having so much difficulty with the written word is that understanding the meaning of a sentence very often is informed not just by the meaning of the words and the grammar, but by a huge amount of cultural, historical, sociological influence. And you see this especially in the example of something called Winograd challenges, which often catch AI out in trying to understand what a sentence means. So there's some ambiguity in a Winograd challenge, which we're able to pick up very easily, but AI cannot. Take, for example, the sentence, the government bans the protesters from marching because they feared violence. So we all know that the they in that case refers to the government, but if I changed it to they advocated violence, that they would then correspond to the protesters. But an AI has a huge amount of difficulty knowing what the they is referring to in either case. And that's because the meaning is informed by culture and history and sociology, not just well-formed sentences. So again, I think this is one of the challenges with the written word, is that just giving it data sets of well-formed sentences will not be enough for it to be able to really do anything more than make well-formed sentences. So although this sequential nature of music and the written word, I think, has given AI a way to start making music and writing things, it's only really successfully locally and not globally. So it can do bursts of Bach, it can do a jazz riff, or it can write 350 words, which makes some sort of sense. In fact, 350 words of my book is in fact written by an AI, not by me, and it's so convincing that not even my editor knows which are the 350 words that the AI wrote. But if it tries to do anything sort of longer than this, it starts to lose the plot, quite literally, in the sense of the spoken word. So I think it's the global nature of music and the written word that AI is having a lot of difficulty with. And the key element here, I think, is the fact that there's a time element involved in music, and in some sense a narrative form as well, which is missing in the visual world. The visual world is like a snapshot, a frozen moment of time. whilst music has a very key temporal element to it. And this seems to be what is, I would say, is the major challenge going forward for AI, being able to create something which has some sort of global structure, is something which makes sense over a whole long length of time. So although it's very successful making things which locally make sense, the global nature of a piece, I think, is really where the challenge is for creativity in the music and in the written word. And it's interesting that MuseNet, which we used for the Bach project, considers music in a very symbolic form. So it really is taking symbols and saying what symbols might come next. And I think we need to move to different ways of trying to analyze music and the written word, not in this kind of very discrete way. So for something like WaveNet by DeepMind, that's taking not symbolic form, but audio files, and trying to understand those and learn from those. So I think that's an interesting way to sort of break out of this obsession with what might come next in a sequence. But actually, I think the most interesting thing would be to take some of the ways we look at the visual world and see whether those can be used to think of music and the spoken word. So almost to think of music atemporally, as just one entity. In fact, I think many composers will do this. They will think of their music in sort of one go. I think Mozart sort of talked about the fact that he could almost see a piece of music and take it outside of time. So for me, I think that would be a very interesting way forward to perhaps take some of the algorithms that are looking at a visual as a snapshot and see whether we can use those perhaps to understand music as some sort of snapshot which might overcome this temporal element, which seems to be a real difficulty in creating music. And I think for me, one of the exciting things is to take some of the successes in the visual world and see whether we can make them work in a musical context. One of my favorite visual algorithms recently was Google's X degrees of separation. And this is a project where they've mapped the visual world, almost quite literally. You can see a sort of landscape. And then if you take two visuals, perhaps an artwork from Rembrandt and then a Warhol, or even just a picture of a Roman jug that has been made out of clay, it will find a route, perhaps 10 images, which will take you from one to the other. And the route is very interesting because it goes through some strange twists and turns, but it shows the connectivity between these two. So I would love to have a kind of musical version of that, where you're given two pieces of music, maybe Bach's English Suite, Stormzy's Shut Up, and you try and find a sequence of pieces of music which takes you from one to the other. I think this will be very challenging, and I've talked to the people who made X degrees of separation, and one of the problems is how do you compare two pieces of music as being close when you have this time element to them. Visuals are restricted to 2 or 3 dimensions. The problem with music is it's a very high dimensional form, so trying to map that in a coherent way such you can talk about pieces of music being close seems a real challenge. But I think that this is the direction to go forward in, is actually mixing these disciplines much more than we have been. That's how the human mind works. We are creative because of all the music we listen to, the literature we read, the visuals we're inundated with. And it's these fusions of art forms that produces, I think, the most interesting results. And perhaps that's going to be the way forward for AI art, is not to restrict our data sets just to music, but to perhaps include something much broader in trying to create interesting AI music.